Continuing where I left off, Part 3, Chapter 1. Prince Vassily was not a man who deliberately thought out his plans. Still less did he think of harming anyone in order to gain his own ends. He was simply a man of the world who had got on, and to whom getting on had become a habit. Various plans and schemes for which he never rightly accounted to himself, but which constituted his whole interest in life, were continually forming in his mind, arising from the circumstances and the persons he met. He had not merely one or two such plans and schemes on the way, but dozens, some of which were just beginning to take shape, some nearing achievement, still others dissolving. He did not say to himself, for instance, "Now this man has influence. I must gain his confidence and friendship, and through him arrange to obtain a special grant." Nor did he say to himself, "Now Pierre is a rich man. I must entice him to marry my daughter and lend me the 40,000 rubles I need." But when he encountered a man of influence, he immediately told him that this man could be useful, and Prince Vassily struck up an acquaintance with him, and, without premeditation, took the first opportunity to gain confidence, flatter him, get on familiar terms with him, and let him know what he wanted. He had Pierre at hand in Moscow, and Prince Vassily procured for him an appointment as gentleman of the bedchamber, which at that time was equal in rank to a councillor of state, and insisted on the young man accompanying him to Petersburg and staying in his house. With apparent absent-mindedness, yet with absolute confidence that he was doing the right thing, Prince Vassily did everything to get Pierre to marry his daughter. Had he thought out his plans beforehand, he could have not been so natural in his behavior, and so artless and familiar in his relations with everyone, whether above him or below him in social standing. He was invariably drawn to people who were richer and more powerful than himself, and he had a rare gift for seizing just the right moment for making use of people. Pierre, on unexpectedly becoming Count Besokov and a rich man, felt himself so occupied, so surrounded by people after his recent loneliness and freedom from cares, that only in bed was he able to be by himself. He had to sign papers to present himself at government offices, the purpose of which was not clear to him, to make inquiries of his chief steward, to visit estates near Moscow, and to receive a great many people who formerly chose to ignore his existence, but now would have been grieved and offended had he chosen not to see them. These various people, businessmen, relations, acquaintances, were all equally cordial and well disposed toward the young heir. They were all obviously and unequivocally convinced of Pierre's superior qualities. He was continually hearing such words as, "with your extraordinary kindness," or "with your excellent heart," or "you yourself are so honorable, Count," or if he were as clever as you," and so on, till he actually began to believe in his extraordinary kindness and exceptional intelligence. The more so since at heart it had always seemed to him that he really was very kind and intelligent. Even people who had formerly been malicious and openly hostile to him now became tender and affectionate. The irascible eldest princess with the long waist and the smooth doll-like hair had come to Pierre's room after the funeral. With lowered eyes and repeated blushes, she told them that she was very sorry about their past misunderstandings, and felt that now she had no right to ask him for anything, except his permission, after the blow she had suffered, to remain for a few weeks longer in the house she so loved, and where she had made so many sacrifices. At these words she could not refrain from weeping. Touched at seeing such a change in this statue-like princess, Pierre took her hand and begged her forgiveness for what he did not know. From that day, the eldest princess began to knit a striped scarf for Pierre, and was completely changed toward him. "Do this for my sake, mon cher." After all, she had to put up with a great deal from the deceased. said Prince Vasily to him, handing him a document to sign the princess's benefit. Prince Vasily had decided in any case it was imperative to throw this bone, a promissory note for 30,000 rubles to the poor princess in order to forestall her talking about his share in the affair of the inlay portfolio. Pierre signed the note, and after that the princess grew still kinder. The younger sisters all became affectionate to him, especially the youngest, the pretty one with the mole, whose smiles and confusion when he appeared often embarrassed him. It seemed so natural to Pierre that everyone liked him, and would have seemed so entirely unnatural had anyone not liked him, that he could not help believing in the sincerity of those around him. Besides, he had no time to ask himself whether or not they were sincere. He was always busy, and always in a state of mild and cheerful intoxication. He felt as though he were the center of some important general movement, continuously felt that something was expected of him, which he must perform, or many people would be grieved and disappointed, but that if he did this or that, all would be well. So he did what was required of him, but still that happy outcome always remained in the future. In those first days, more than anyone else, Prince Vasily took charge of Pierre's affairs, and of Pierre himself. After the death of Count Busukov, he did not let Pierre slip out of his hands. He had the air of a man oppressed by business, weary, harassed, but who, out of compassion, was unable to abandon to the vagaries of fate and the designs of rogues this helpless youth, the son, after all, of his friend and the possessor of such an enormous fortune into the bargain. During the few days he spent in Moscow after the death of Count Busukov, he would send for Pierre, or go to himself, and instruct each time in what ought to be done in a tone of such weariness and assurance as if to say, "You know, I am overwhelmed with business, and it is simply out of pity that I concern myself with you. And besides, you know quite well that what I propose is the only feasible thing to do." "Well, my friend, tomorrow we are off at last," said Prince Vasily one day, closing his eyes and fingering Pierre's elbow, speaking as if the matter had long since been settled between them and could have not been decided otherwise. "Tomorrow we shall leave. I'm giving you a place in my carriage. I am glad. All our important affairs here have been settled. I thought I ought to have left long ago. Here, I received this from the Chancellor. I applied to him for you, and you have been enrolled in the diplomatic corps and made a gentleman of the bedchamber. A diplomatic career is now open to you." Notwithstanding all the force behind that tone of weariness and assurance, Pierre, who had long been thinking about a career, was on the verge of protesting. But Prince Vasily interrupted him in the cooing bass he employed in cases where extreme measures of persuasion were required, and which precluded any possibility of interruption. "Mas, mon cher, I did this for my own sake, to satisfy my conscience, and there is no need to thank me. No one has ever yet complained of being too well loved, and besides, you are free. You can throw it up all tomorrow. But you will see everything for yourself when you get to Petersburg. It's high time you got away from all these dreadful memories." Prince Vasily sighed. "Just so, my dear boy, and my valet can go in your carriage. Oh yes, I was almost forgetting," he added. "You know, monsieur, your father and I had some accounts to settle, so as I have received something from the Ryazan estate, I'll keep it. You won't be needing it. We'll go into the accounts later." What Prince Vasily called something from the Ryazan estate was several thousand roubles in quitrent, which he retained for himself. In Petersburg, as in Moscow, Pierre found himself surrounded by tenderness and affection. He could not decline the post, or rather the title, for he did nothing, that Prince Vasily had procured for him, and acquaintances, invitations, and social obligations were so numerous that even more than in Moscow Pierre felt a sense of bewilderment, bustle, and the continual expectation of a future good which was never realized. Of his former bachelor acquaintances, with many were no longer in Moscow. The guards were on active duty, Dolokhov had been reduced to the ranks, Anatole was in the army somewhere in the provinces, and Prince Andrea was abroad. Consequently, Pierre no longer had the opportunity of spending his nights as he had liked spending them before, nor could he unburden his heart from time to time in intimate talk with a friend older than himself and whom he respected. All his time was spent at dinners and balls, and for the most part at Prince Vassily in the company of the stout elderly princess, Prince Vassily's wife, and the beautiful Ellen. Like everyone else, Anna Pavlovna's share made Pierre aware of the change that had taken place in society's attitude toward him. Formerly in Anna Pavlovna's presence, Pierre had always felt that what he was saying was improper, tactless, and out of place, that remarks which seemed to him clever while he was formulating them in his mind became foolish as soon as they were spoken aloud, whereas Apollote's most obtuse utterance had the effect of being clever and charming. Now everything that Pierre said was so charmant. Even if Anna Pavlovna did not say so, he could see that she was longing to, and only refrained out of regard for his modesty. At the beginning of the winter of 1805 to 1806, Pierre received one of Anna Pavlovna's customary pink notes of invitation, to which was added, "La belle Helene, whom one never tires of seeing, will be here." As he read this, it struck Pierre for the first time that some link that other people recognized had been formed between himself and Ellen, and the thought alarmed him, as if an obligation were being imposed on him that he could not fulfill, and at the same time pleased him as a delightful idea. Anna Pavlovna's soiree was like the former one, only the novelty she offered her guests this time was not Mortemart, but a diplomat who had just arrived from Berlin bringing the latest details of the Emperor Alexander's visit to the Potsdam, and of how the two imperial friends had pledged themselves to an indissoluble alliance to uphold the cause of justice against the enemy of the human race. Pierre was received by Anna Pavlovna with a shade of melancholy, an unmistakable reference to the recent loss sustained by the young man in the death of Count Besukov. Everyone considered it a duty to assure Pierre at every opportunity that he was greatly afflicted by the death of the father he had hardly known, and her melancholy was exactly like the exultant melancholy she always displayed at the mention of her most august majesty, the Empress Maria Fardonova. Pierre felt flattered. Anna Pavlovna had arranged the groups in her drawing room with her customary skill. The large circle in which were Prince Vassily and several generals were graced by the diplomat. Another group was at the tea table. Pierre would have liked to join the former, but Anna Pavlovna, who was in the state of nervous excitement of a general on the battlefield to whom thousands of new and brilliant ideas occur, which there is hardly time to execute, seeing Pierre, put her finger on his sleeve and said, "Attendees, I have something in mind for you this evening." She looked at Ellen and smiled at her. "Mon bonne Helene, be charitable to my poor aunt who adores you. Go, and keep her company for 10 minutes. And that you may not find it too dull, here is our dear Count, who will not refuse to accompany you." The beautiful Ellen went to the aunt, but Anna Pavlovna detained Pierre with an air of having to give him the necessary final instructions. "Isn't she ravishing?" she said to Pierre, indicating the stately beauty as she glided away. "How she carries herself, and such tact for so young a girl, such absolute perfection of manner. It comes from the heart. Happy the man who wins her. As her husband, even the least worldly of men could not fail to occupy a most brilliant position in society. Don't you think so? I just wanted to have your opinion," said, and Anna Pavlovna let Pierre go. Pierre was perfectly sincere in agreeing with Anna Pavlovna as to Ellen's perfection of manner. If he sometimes thought about Ellen, it was precisely of her beauty and this extraordinary ability of hers to be dignified and serenely silent in society. The old aunt received the two young people in her corner, but seemed inclined rather to show her fear of Anna Pavlovna than her adoration of Ellen. She looked at her niece, as if inquiring what she was to do with these people. Anna Pavlovna again laid a finger on Pierre's sleeve. "I trust that in future you will never say that one is bored in my house," she said with a glance at Ellen. Ellen smiled with an air of saying that she did not omit of the possibility of anyone seeing her without being enchanted. The aunt cleared her throat, swallowed, and said in French that she was very glad to see Ellen, then turned to Pierre with the same greeting and the same mien. In the middle of a dull and halting conversation, Ellen looked at Pierre and gave him the same beautiful, brilliant smile she gave to everyone. Pierre was so used to this smile, and it had so little meaning for him, that he paid no attention to it. At that moment, the aunt was speaking of a collection of snuff boxes that had belonged to Pierre's father, Count Boucicault, and showed them her own snuff box. Princess Ellen asked to see the portrait of the aunt's husband on the lid. "That is probably the work of Venice," said Pierre, mentioning a celebrated miniaturist, and he leaned over the table to take the snuff box, trying all the while to listen to the conversation at the other table. He half rose, meaning to go around to her, but the aunt handed him the snuff box, passing it behind Ellen's back. Ellen leaned forward to make room and looked back with a smile. She was, as always, at evening parties, wearing a dress cut very low in front and in back, which was fashionable at the time. Her bust, which had always seemed like marble to Pierre, was so close that his nearsighted eyes could not help perceiving the vital charm of her neck and shoulders, so near to his lips that he need only to have bent his head slightly to have touched them. He was aware of the warmth of her body, the scent of her perfume, and heard the creak of her corset as she breathed. Instead of the marble beauty constituting a whole with her dress, he saw and felt the complete allure of her body, concealed only by her garments. And having once seen this, he could not see her otherwise, just as we cannot return to a delusion once it has been exposed. She looked back, gazing at him with her brilliant black eyes, and smiled. "So, you have never before noticed how beautiful I am," she seemed to say. "You haven't noticed that I am a woman?" "Yes, I am a woman who may belong to anyone, even to you," her eyes said. And at that moment, Pierre felt that Ellen not only could, but must be his wife, that it could not be otherwise. He knew it as surely as if he had been standing beside her at the altar. How this would be and when he did not know. He did not even know if it would be a good thing. Actually, he felt that for some reason it would be wrong, but he knew that it was to be. Pierre dropped his eyes, then raised them again, and tried to see her as a remote beauty, alien to him, as he had seen her every day till then. But it was no longer possible. He could no more do it than a man who has been gazing through the mist at a tuft of steep grass that he has taken for a tree can go back to seeing the tree once he has recognized it as grass. She was terribly close to him. Already she exerted a power over him, and between them there was no longer any barrier except the barrier of his will. "Bon, I will leave you in your little corner. I see you are all right there," Anna Pavlovna's voice was heard to say, and Pierre, anxiously trying to recall whether he had done anything reprehensible, looked up with a blush. It seemed to him that everyone knew as well as he did what had happened to him. A little later, when he joined the large circle, Anna Pavlovna said to him, "I hear you're having your Petersburg house decorated." This was true. The architect had told him it was necessary, and Pierre, without knowing why, was having his enormous mansion in Petersburg redecorated. "That's very nice, but don't move away from Prince Vassily. It's good to have a friend like the prince," she said, with a smile at Prince Vassily. "I know something about that, don't I? And you are still so young. You need advice. Don't be angry with me for exercising the prerogatives of an old woman." She paused expectantly, as women always do after mentioning their age. "If you marry, that will be another matter." And she united them in a glance. Pierre did not look at Ellen, nor she at him, but she was still terribly close to him. He mumbled something and blushed. When he returned home, it was a long time before Pierre could fall asleep. He kept thinking of what had happened to him. But what had happened? Nothing. He had merely realized that a woman he had known as a child, a woman of whom, when her beauty was mentioned, he had differently said, "Yes, She's good looking. He had realized that this woman could belong to him. But she is stupid. I myself have said she is stupid, he thought. This is not love. On the contrary, this is something abhorrent, something forbidden in the feeling she arouses in me. I have been told that her brother Anatole was in love with her, and she with him, that there was a great scandal, and that is why he was sent away. And Hippolyte is her brother, Prince Vassily her father. It's all wrong, he thought. But while he was reflecting, and his reflections were still incomplete, he found himself smiling and was conscious that another line of thought had arisen out of the first, and that even while thinking of her worthlessness, he was dreaming of how she would be his wife, how she would love him, might become quite different, and how everything he had thought and heard about her might be untrue. And again he saw her not as the daughter of Prince Vassily, but visualized her whole body, concealed only by her gray gown. But why did this thought never occur to me before? And once more he told himself that it was impossible, that there would be something abhorrent and unnatural, and, as it seemed to him, dishonorable in this marriage. He recalled her recent words and glances, and the words and looks of those who had seen them together. He recalled what Anna Pavlovna had said, and the way she had looked when she spoke to him about his house, recalled hundreds of such hints on the part of Prince Vassily and others, and he was appalled by the realization that he might already have bound himself in some way to do something that was manifestly wrong, and that he ought not to do. But at the same time he experienced this conviction. In another part of his mind, her image rose in all its feminine beauty. Chapter 2. In November 1805, Prince Vassily was obliged to go on a tour of inspection through 4 of the provinces. He had obtained this commission for the twofold purpose of visiting his neglected states and of taking his son Anatole, whose regiment was stationed on the way, to visit Prince Nikolai Andreyevich Bolkonsky, with a view to arranging a marriage for him with the daughter of the rich old man. But before going away and embarking on these new affairs, Prince Vassily had to settle matters with Pierre, who, it is true, had lately spent whole days at home, that is, in Prince Vassily's house where he was staying, and had been excited, absorbed, and foolish in Ellen's presence, as a lover should be, but still had made no proposal. That is all well and good, but it must be settled, said Prince Vassily to himself one morning, sighing dolorously as he reflected that Pierre, who was so greatly indebted to him, but let that pass, was not behaving very well in this matter. Youth, frivolity, well, God be with him, he thought, with a feeling of gratification at his own goodness of heart. But it must be brought to a conclusion. The day after tomorrow is Loloya's name day. I'll invite a few people, and if he doesn't understand what he ought to do, then it will be my business to see to it. Yes, my business. I am her father. 6 weeks after Anna Pavlovna's soiree, which had resulted in the agitated, sleepless night, when he had decided that a marriage with Ellen would be a calamity, and that he ought to avoid her and go away, Pierre still had not moved from Prince Vassily. He felt with horror that he was every day more and more bound to her in people's eyes, that it was impossible for him to return to his former conception of her, that he could not tear himself away from her, and that although it would be a dreadful thing, he would have to unite his fate with hers. He might have been able to restrain himself, but for the fact that at Prince Vassily, where formerly receptions had rarely been given, hardly a day passed without an evening party at which Pierre was obliged to be present, and if he did not wish to spoil the general pleasure and disappointment, everyone. Prince Vassily, in those rare moments when he was at home, would take Pierre's hand in passing, and drawing him down, absent-mindedly offered his wrinkled, clean-shaven cheek to kiss, saying, "Till tomorrow," or "Be in for dinner," or "I shan't see you," or "I'm staying home on your account," and so on. And though when he did stay in for Pierre's sake, as he said, he hardly exchanged 2 words with him, Pierre felt unable to disappoint him. Every day he said the same thing to himself. I must understand her once and for all, and try to comprehend what she really is. Was I mistaken before, or am I mistaken now? No, she is not stupid. She is a fine young woman, he sometimes said to himself. She never does anything wrong, never says anything silly. She says little, but what she says is always simple and clear. So she's not stupid. No, she's a fine young woman. She has never been disconcerted, and she's not confused now, so she cannot be a bad woman. It often happened that he began to reason, to think aloud in her presence, and she always responded either with a brief but appropriate remark showing that she was not interested, or with a silent glance and smile, to which Pierre proved her superiority more palpably than anything else. She was right to regard all discussions as nonsense in comparison with that smile. She always turned to him with a radiant, confiding smile, a smile meant for him alone, in which there was something more significant than in the smile that generally adorned her face. Pierre knew that everyone was only waiting for him to say one word, to cross a certain boundary, and he knew that sooner or later he would cross it, but an incomprehensible horror seized him at the mere thought of that dreadful step. 1,000 times in the course of these 6 weeks, during which he had felt himself being drawn nearer and nearer to that terrifying abyss, Pierre said to himself, "But what is it? Resolution is what is required. Can it be that I have none?" He tried to come to a decision, but he felt with dismay that in this instance he lacked the strength of will which he had known in himself, and which he really did possess. Pierre was one of those people who are strong only when they feel that they are absolutely pure, and since that day he had been overpowered by a feeling of desire while bending over the snuff box at Anna Palanova. An unconscious sense of the guilt of that passion paralyzed his will. On Ellen's name day, a small party of only their nearest and dearest, as his wife said, met for the supper at Prince Vassily's. All these friends and relations had been given to understand that the fate of the young princess was to be decided on that evening. The guests were seated at supper. Princess Karágina, a portly, imposing, once beautiful woman, was sitting at the head of the table. On either side of her sat the most honored guests, an elderly general and his wife, and Anna Pavlovna Shira. At the other end of the table were the younger and less important guests, and there too, as members of the family, were Pierre and Ellen side by side. Prince Vassily was not having supper. He moved around the table in a convivial mood, sitting down now by one, now by another of the guests. To each of them, except Pierre and Ellen, whom he seemed not to notice, he made some casual, pleasant remark. He was the life of the party. The wax candles burned brightly. The silver and crystal on the table gleamed, as did the ladies' attire and the gold and silver of the men's epaulets. Servants in scarlet livery threaded their way in and out around the table, and the clatter of knives, plates, and glasses mingled with the hum of several animated conversations. At one end of the table, an elderly chamberlain was heard assuring an aging baroness of his ardent love, while she laughed. At the other, someone was recounting the misfortunes of a certain Marya Viktorovna. In the middle, Prince Vasily held the attention of his listeners as, with a facetious smile on his lips, he told the ladies about last Wednesday's meeting of the Imperial Council at which Sergei Kuzmich Bezatana, the new military governor-general of Petersburg, had received and read the rescript, much talked of at the time, which the Emperor Alexander Palanova had sent to him from the army, saying that from all sides he was receiving declarations of the people's devotion, that the testimony from Petersburg was particularly gratifying to him, that he was proud of the honor of being at the head of such a nation and would endeavor to be worthy of it. This rescript began with the words, "Sergei Kuzmich, from all sides reports reach me," and so on. "And I suppose he got no further than Sergei Kuzmich?" asked one of the ladies. "No, not a syllable," answered Prince Vasily, laughing. "Sergei Kuzmich, from all sides. From all sides. Sergei Kuzmich." Poor Vyamativa could not go on. Several times he started the letter, but no sooner did he utter the word Sergei than sniff. Kuzmich, tears, and from all sides, choked with sobs and could go no further. And again the handkerchief, and again. Sergei Kuzmich from all sides in tears, till finally someone else was asked to read it. Kuzmich from all sides, and then tears. Someone repeated, laughing. Don't be unkind, said Anna Pavlovna from the other end of the table, shaking her finger at him. He is such a worthy, excellent man, our good Valyamitov. Everyone laughed heartily. At the head of the table, where the honored guest sat, everyone appeared to be in high spirits and under the sway of a variety of stimulating moods. Only Pierre and Ellen sat silently side by side at the other end of the table, a restrained smile brightening both their faces, a smile that had nothing to do with Sergei Kuzmich, a smile of shyness at their own emotions. However much the others talked, laughed, and jested, however much they enjoyed the Rhine wine, the soiree, and the ices, and regardless of how they seemed to avoid looking at the young couple, to be heedless and unobservant of them, it was somehow felt from the occasional glances in their direction that the anecdote about Sergei Kuzmich, the laughter, and the food were all a pretext, and that the whole attention of the company was directed to that pair, Pierre and Ellen. Even as Prince Vassily mimicked the sobbing of Sergei Kuzmich, his glance strayed to his daughter, and when he laughed, his expression seemed to say, "Yes, it's all going well. It will be all settled tonight." Anna Pavlovna shook her finger at him for laughing at our good Vasyly, but in her eyes, which at that moment darted a glance at Pierre, Prince Vassily read congratulations on his future son-in-law and his daughter's happiness. The old princess, pensively, sighing as she offered wine to the lady next to her, looked crossly at her daughter, and her sigh seemed to say, "Yes, there's nothing left for you and me, my dear, but to sip sweet wine. Now that's the time has come for these young ones to be so boldly, flagrantly happy. And what nonsense all this is, what I'm talking, as if it interested me," thought a diplomat, glancing at the happy faces of the lovers. "Now that is happiness." Into the midst of inconsequential, petty, artificial intelligence, uniting the company had fallen the simple feelings of the attraction of a handsome, healthy young man and woman for each other. And this human feeling predominated over everything else and soared above all their affected chatter. Jests fell flat. News was not interesting. The animation was patently forced. Not only the guests but the footmen waiting at the table seemed to feel this and were mindful of their duties as they looked at the beautiful Ellen with her radiant face, and at Pierre's broad, red, happy, if uneasy, countenance. It seemed as if even the candle light was concentrated on those two happy faces. Pierre felt that he was the center of it all, and his position both pleased and embarrassed him. He was like a man absorbed in anything clearly. Only now and then fragments of thoughts and impressions of reality flashed unexpectedly into his mind. "So it is all over," he thought, "and how all this happened, and so quickly. Now I know that not for her alone, not for me alone, but for everyone, it must be inevitably come about. They all expect it, are all so confident it will happen that I cannot disappoint them. But how will it be? I do not know. But it certainly will be," thought Pierre, glancing at those gleaming shoulders directly under his eyes. Then, all at once, he began to feel shame. He felt awkward at being the object of everyone's attention, at being considered a lucky man, and with his handsomely homely face, to be regarded as a kind of Paris in possession of a Helen. But probably it has always been and must so. And yet, what have I done to bring it about? When did it begin? I traveled from Moscow with Prince Vassily. There was nothing then. Afterward, what reason was there for not staying at his house? Then I played cards with her, picked up her reticule, went driving with her. When did it begin? How did it all come about? And here he was sitting beside her as her betrothed, hearing, seeing, feeling, her closeness, her breathing, her movements, her beauty. Then it suddenly seemed to him that it was not she, but he who was so extraordinarily beautiful. That was why they were all looking at him and elated by the general admiration. He drew himself up, raised his head, and rejoiced in his good fortune. Suddenly he heard a familiar voice saying something to him for the second time. But Pierre was so preoccupied he did not understand what was said. "I'm asking you when you last heard from Bolkowski," Prince Vasily repeated for the third time. "How absent-minded you are, my dear boy." Prince Vasily smiled, and Pierre noticed that everyone was smiling at him and Ellen. "Well, what of it, since you all know," thought Pierre. "What of it? It's the truth." He himself smiled this gentle, childlike smile, and Ellen smiled too. "When did you receive the letter?" "Was it from Olmutz?" repeated Prince Vasily, as if he wanted to know in order to settle the dispute. "It is possible to talk and think of such trifles," Pierre wondered. "Yes, from Olmutz," he answered with a sigh. After supper, Pierre and his partner followed the others into the drawing-room. The guests began to take their leave, several going without saying goodbye to Ellen. Others, as if reluctant to distract her from serious concerns, approached her for a moment, then hurried away, refusing to let her see them off. The diplomat left the drawing-room in a mournful silence. He was picturing the futility of his diplomatic career compared to Pierre's happiness. The elderly general muttered angrily at his wife when she asked how his leg was. "Oh, the old fool," he thought. "Now that Ellen Vassiliana, she's still beautiful when she's 50. "It seems I may congratulate you," whispered Anna Pavlovna to Princess Kuragina, kissing her warmly. "If it were not for this migraine, I'd have stayed on." The princess did not reply. She was tormented by envy of her daughter's happiness. While the guests were taking their leave, Pierre remained a long time alone with Ellen in the little drawing-room where they had been sitting. He had often before, during the last 6 weeks, been left alone with her, but had never spoken to her of love. Now he felt that it was obligatory, but he could not make up his mind to take this final step. He felt ashamed. It seemed to him that he was occupying someone else's place beside Ellen. "This happiness is not for you," some inner voice said to him. "This happiness is for those who do not have within them what you have." But he had to say something, and he began by asking whether she had enjoyed the evening. She replied with her habitual simplicity that for her this name day had been one of the most pleasant she had ever had. Some of the nearest relations had not yet left. They were sitting in the large drawing-room. Prince Vasily languidly approached Pierre. Pierre rose and said that it was getting late. Prince Vasily gave him a look of stern inquiry, as if what he had just heard was so strange that he could not believe his ears. But then the expression of severity changed, and Prince Vasily took Pierre's hand, smiled affectionately, and made him sit down beside him. "Well, Laloya," he asked, instantly addressing his daughter in that casual tone of habitual tenderness natural to parents who have pampered their children from infancy, but which Prince Vasily had acquired only by imitating other parents. And again he turned to Pierre. "Sergei Kuzmich," from all sides, he repeated, unbuttoning the top button of his waistcoat. Pierre smiled, but from his smile it was clear that he realized that the anecdote about Sergei Kuzmich was not what interested Prince Vasily at that moment, and Prince Vasily saw that Pierre understood this. All at once Prince Vasily mumbled something and went away. It seemed to Pierre that even Prince Vasily was disconcerted. The sight of this elderly man of the world losing his composure touched Pierre. He glanced at Ellen, and she too appeared to be disconcerted, and her look seemed to say, "Well, it's you who are to blame." "I must inevitably take the step, but I cannot, thought Pierre, and again commenced speaking of irrelevant matters and asking what was the point of the story about Sergei Kuzmich, as he had not caught all of it. Ellen replied with a smile that she too had missed it. When Prince Vasily returned to the drawing-room, the princess, his wife, was talking in subdued tones to an elderly lady about Pierre. "Of course, it's a brilliant match, but happiness, mon cher. Marriages are made in heaven," replied the elderly lady. Prince Vasily, as though not hearing the ladies, walked to the farthest corner of the room and sat down on the sofa. He closed his eyes and seemed to be dozing, on the verge of nodding. He roused himself. "Aline, go and see what they are doing," he said to his wife in French. The princess went to the door, and walking by it with a casual but significant air, glanced into the little drawing-room. Pierre and Ellen sat talking as before. Still the same, she said to her husband. Prince Vassily frowned. His mouth was drawn to one side, his cheeks twitched, and his face assumed the coarse, disagreeable expression peculiar to him. He shook himself, got up, threw back his head, and with a resolute step walked past the ladies into the little drawing room. He went up to Pierre with joyous haste. When Pierre caught sight of his extraordinary jubilant expression, he rose in alarm. "Thank God," said Prince Vasily. "My wife just told me everything." He put one arm around Pierre and the other around his daughter. "My dear boy, Lyoya, I am very, very glad." His voice was unsteady. "I love your father, and she will make you a good wife. God bless you." He embraced his daughter, then Pierre again, and kissed him with his old man lips. His cheeks were actually wet with tears. "Princess, come here," he called. The old princess came in and also wept. The elderly lady put her handkerchief to her eyes. They kissed Pierre, and he kissed the beautiful Ellen's hand several times. Presently they were left alone again. All this had to be, and could not have been otherwise, thought Pierre. So it's useless to ask whether it's good or bad. It's good in that it's definite, and there is no longer that tormenting doubt. Pierre sat in silence, holding his betrothed's hand and gazing at the rise and fall of her beautiful bosom. "Ellen," he said aloud and stopped. "There is something special that is always said on these occasions," he thought, but could not remember what it was. He glanced at her face. She moved nearer to him. Her face was flaming. "Oh, take off those," he pointed to his spectacles. Pierre took them off, and his eyes, besides the strange look people's eyes always have when their eyeglasses are removed, had a frightened, inquiry look. He was about to bend over her hand and kiss it, but with a precipitant, brutal movement of her head, she intercepted his lips and met with her own. Pierre was shocked by the change in her face, but it was unpleasantly abandoned expression. "It's too late now. It's done. Besides, I love her," thought Pierre. "Je vous aime," he said, remembering what it was that had been said on these occasions. But the words sounded so inadequate that he felt ashamed of himself. 6 weeks later he was married and settled in the large, newly furnished mansion of the Count Busakov in Petersburg, the fortunate possessor, as people said, of a beautiful wife and millions. Thank you for watching this episode of Tolstoy's War and Peace. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, give it a thumbs down. Leave a comment below. You can